Scientist webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, President and CEO of the Foundation, and your host and moderator for today's webinar. Today, Dr. Andrew Nierenberg will present a webinar entitled, Is Bipolar Disorder an Energy Disorder? Evidence and Novel Treatments. The Brain and Behavior Research Foundation is dedicated to funding research around the world to identify the causes, improve treatments, and ultimately develop cures and preventative techniques for mental illness. The Foundation has awarded more than $320 million in research grants over the last 26 years. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Andrew Nierenberg. Dr. Nierenberg is Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, Co-Director of the Bipolar Clinic and Research Program and Associate Director of the Depression Clinical and Research Program at Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Nierenberg's primary research interests are treatment-resistant depression, bipolar depression, and the longitudinal course of mood disorders. He also maintains an active clinical practice and conducts clinical trials. He's published over 350 papers and 30 chapters and reviews. Dr. Nierenberg attended the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, followed by a residency in psychiatry at New York University Bellevue Hospital, and then became a Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholar at Yale University. In 1992, he joined the psychiatry department at Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Nierenberg was awarded 2 Foundation-funded independent research grants in 2000 and 2003, and was the recipient of the 2013 Colvin Prize for Outstanding Achievement in Mood Disorders, and is a member of the Foundation's Scientific Council. The Council identifies the most promising ideas to fund with Foundation grants each year. This will be an interactive event. We'll start with Dr. Nierenberg's presentation, followed by a question and answer period. To submit your questions, please use the Questions tab of the webinar control panel. You can submit your questions throughout the presentation. As your moderator, I will present your questions to Dr. Nierenberg, and we will address as many as possible. And now, I'm pleased to present Dr. Andrew Nierenberg.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much, and thank you to the Foundation for supporting such really important work across the board. The work that the Foundation has done has really helped to develop new ways of thinking about psychiatric disorders and new ways of thinking of treatment. To that end, I'll be talking about bipolar disorder as an energy disorder and maybe not just as a mood disorder. I'm going to go over some evidence for that, and then I'll talk about some novel treatments, 2 of which are actually funded by the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. So it really shows how essential the Foundation is. Let's see, I'm supposed to be able to
just click on the slide.
Here we go. These are my disclosures because I work with a lot of companies and other people to be able to develop new treatments. Okay, I'd also like to give thanks to my colleagues Edward Maya, Luisa Silvia, and Paolo Cassano, and also the Foundation for helping me in this work. So here's the outline. To talk about energy, I have to talk about the batteries of energy in our cells called mitochondria, and then I have to talk about some complicated switches called PPARs and PGC1 alpha. Don't be intimidated by the letters and the terms. I'll explain all of that. And then I'm going to talk about some new treatments. Some of the treatments use old things, right? So I'll talk about mitochondria, the power plants. I'm going to talk about PPARs and PGC1 alpha, some of the switches for the power plants, and then I'll talk about new treatments. So the first thing is that we are all made of stars, and that within us there are tiny power plants that help us do anything, help us move, do any type of activity, And also, as I'll show you in a little while, it's essential to have these little stars, these little mitochondria, to be able to think. So we have 3 pounds of brains in our head, and that 3 pounds takes up somewhere between 20 and 25% of our bodily energy. It is just extraordinary. Our brains are hungry. Our brains need to be fed. Our brains need energy constantly. Now, one of the reasons why it needs such a large amount of energy from the little stars, the little mitochondria, is that we have very complicated networks. And the networks communicate with each other. They're dynamic. They change. They form connections. They break connections. And that all takes a lot of energy. And if you look even closer at some of the networks, it's just a beautiful picture. It's just a beautiful thing that exists in our head. It's really extraordinary, exquisite, and complex. And it also takes up energy, as I just said. And there are certain areas of the brain that take up more energy, even if you're at rest. And there are 2 particular areas called the posterior cingulate cortex and the precuneus, where that arrow is. That takes up a lot of energy there. So when you look at certain neuroimaging studies, you'll see that those areas are, quote, hot, unquote. Again, taking up a lot of energy. And in fact, there was a nice paper on this, on the selfish brain and neuroprogression in bipolar disorder. Selfish brain meaning that the brain really wants to get as much energy as it can. And neuroprogression is that for many, as bipolar disorder goes on into their older ages or as they become more and more ill, there are brain changes that can happen with that. Much of this work, by the way, has been done by Roger McIntyre and some other people across the world. Tadafumi Kato has done a lot of this, and Anna Andreazza and Trevor Young up in Canada, and Flavio Kapczynski down in Brazil, and also Michael Burke in Australia. So mitochondria. Mitochondria, they are so complicated and so wonderful, and we make them all the time. We make the proteins that make them. They balance the energy that you need. They sense what you need. And this is why you breathe. Right? So you breathe in order to bring oxygen to the mitochondria. It's also why we eat. We eat in order to be able to bring nutrients for the mitochondria essentially to burn up. And so you breathe and you eat, and that's how you get energy. And the mitochondria are these tiny things that convert breathing and eating into energy. And they are these miracles of engineering that end up forming something called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. And that is how the mitochondria and the rest of your body stores and uses energy. So you breathe, you eat, and by doing that, you form ATP, and then the rest of your body uses ATP as the energy source. Now, what do mitochondria do with the brain? Well, they allow neurons to change, to function, and to grow. And believe it or not, if you haven't heard this before, even as adults, we grow new neurons. We have neuronal stem cells in our brains in certain areas, and new neurons will grow from that. Again, that takes energy. Also, they'll form new extensions in order to communicate with each other. Those are called the dendrites. Mitochondria help with that. And also will form new connections between the neuronal cells in the brain. Those are new synapses. So mitochondria are central to this functioning of this marvelous 3 pounds that we have in our heads. Here is a picture of what one of the mitochondria look like. Again, on the face of it, well, it has these membranes, and it has this blue stuff in the middle, the matrix, and all sorts of chemical reactions, protein synthesis, and other things happen in these, it's not just that you eat, breathe, and make ATP, but instead what happens is it goes through a very complex electron transport chain that also has a beautiful architecture. The bottom line with this particular picture, and this is what is in the membrane, is that basically by shuttling electrons around a little bit like a wire, you'll have an exchange between electrons and protons, and it's the protons that drive the thing all the way on the right. That's complex 5 here, and this is a little machinery that actually will form ATP from ADP, that's adenosine diphosphate, by adding one phosphate group. And this thing actually, believe it or not, turns around. It's a little motor that does that, that's driven by the hydrogen coming through here. So just look at that elegance for a minute. I mean, it is just absolutely extraordinary. Each of these complexes are complex, and each are made of a lot of subunits and little proteins that all come together. Now, some of the proteins here, as I'll show you in a moment, seem to be abnormal in bipolar disorder. So we all want to grow our brains. This is taken from a cab that I found in Pittsburgh. Why they'd want to grow your brains in Pittsburgh, I'm not sure, but it's good to grow your brain in the right way. So let's look at just some of the mitochondrial abnormalities that you can have in bipolar disorder. One of the problems is that some of the genes for mitochondria are just not turned on. They're not quite turned on as much as they should be. Other is that there are studies that show that the actual amount of energy that's used by brains in people who have bipolar disorder is decreased in certain areas. And there's also a decreased use of calcium. And while I won't get into the chemistry of it, calcium is also necessary for mitochondria to do what they need to do. Okay, so there are problems with genes, there's problems with energy, and there are problems with calcium. Now, the other interesting thing from a paper that was just published this year is that the energy symptoms seem to be more frequent and more important than the mood symptoms in bipolar disorder. The energy symptoms are a sense of increased energy. So people feel like they're full of energy especially when they're manic. Increased activity, they actually move around more, and decreased need for sleep. Where the mood symptoms of euphoria, feeling absolutely fantastic, or being irritable and angry, or having increased self-esteem, turn out to be less informative for the manic state. And some people actually even have interpreted the mood symptoms as being turning up the volume on mood, and that being what's called dysregulated. It's like your thermostat is just not working the way it's supposed to, and that even the mood symptoms are driven by an excess of energy. So in summary, for the mitochondria, they are essential for the neurons, the basic cells of the brain, to work. In bipolar disorder, there's abnormal brain energy metabolism. In also the electron transport chain, one of the complex doesn't work as well as it should, and the energy-related symptoms may be more informative than the mood symptoms. So this led Trevor Young up in Canada, in Toronto, to ask the question, is bipolar disorder actually a mitochondrial disease? And you can reframe that in saying, is bipolar disorder an energy disease, an energy dysregulation, a type of situation where the thermostat to regulate energy is just not working as well as one would like it to. So there are all sorts of tools that the mitochondria use, and some of them are simple and some of them are a little complicated. But what I want to do in particular is to review some of the switches, and I don't put this up to say anything bad about men at all, but there are a lot of switches that are interacting in order to make things work. And two of those switches that interlock are really complicated, and it took me a long time to try to understand what these things do, and I will do my best to try to help you understand what I now understand. And this has to do with PPARs and PGC1 alpha, where the PPARs are the switches and the PGC1 alpha is one of the keys and the locks that turn switches on and off. So let's go through this carefully. And again, I'll try to do this as best as I can. So what's a PPAR? A PPAR is a mouthful. A PPAR is a peroxisome proliferator activated receptor. And what's a PGC1 alpha? Well, it's a PPAR gamma coactivator. Now, it's almost impossible to understand what these things are unless I tell you a little bit of a story of how this actually works. So the peroxisome proliferator activated receptors, commonly known as PPARs, they're switches that actually turn genes on and off. And let me just explain that a little bit. So we're all made from genes. The genes make proteins, but the genes also make switches, and then the switches have to do with which gene gets turned on and gets turned off. And we have this elegant back and forth between genes being turned on and turned off, and a lot of the switches do that. Well, the PPARs, the peroxisome proliferate activator receptors, are one of these switches. They actually sit on the DNA in the nucleus of the cell, and they can either be active when they turn things on, or they can be inactive when they turn things off. And they can do many things. One is they regulate how we use carbohydrates and fat. In a sense, it may be why you actually get hungry, why you can sense that you're hungry, why you can generate more energy when you exercise, and why you may generate less energy if you're just sitting still for long periods. The other thing that it's a switch for is for anti-inflammatory proteins. So if you have an inflammation of some sort, then this can turn on the anti-inflammatory response so you don't have an inflammation. And also there's something called an antioxidant, which is one of the byproducts of mitochondria, is sort of something that can make your cells, in effect, rust. And you have to have something that goes against that, an anti-rust agent, and those are the antioxidants. So you have to produce those too. And fundamentally, what the PPARs can do is they can protect neurons from all sorts of problems that neurons can have. All right, so those are PPARs. Essentially, think of PPARs as complex switches that can turn DNA on and off. And there are all sorts of PPARs. One is called the gamma here, and it's involved in all sorts of switches. So kidney, heart, different cells, muscle, pancreas, what you do with your fat, and here with brain, so it can actually regulate your food, and I said before, it can decrease inflammation. So again, think of it as a complicated switch where a lot of different switches in a lot of different places, so it can do a lot of different things. Now, PGC1 alpha is a cofactor that can make a lot of genes work, including PPARs. And you don't have to worry about the other sort of switches. We're going to focus on the PPARs. But the PGC1 alpha is named for what it does to PPARs, right? It can help turn on that switch with a complicated story, and it can have broad effects on your metabolism in terms of how you use carbohydrates, how you use lipids, and then what's really interesting, it's also involved in how you build the mitochondria, because you build them all the time. You build them up, they break down, they need it to be replaced, you build it up again. And PGC1 alpha is one of the keys that help you build the mitochondria. So here I'll try to explain how this looks. So here's a PPAR, that's the receptor there, and it has a friend, RXR, and it has something that's keeping it shut off. So think of this as this is the switch, and it's being shut off by what's called a co-repressor. This line represents DNA, and actually you can't turn the DNA on as long as that co-repressor is hanging out. All right, so you have a co-repressor here, you have a switch here, and it has a friend with it, right? So this forms a complex. Here's the switch, turned off. The co-repressor won't let the DNA do what it needs to do to turn genes on. So how do you turn the switch on? Well, something called the ligand comes in, it knocks off the co-repressor, and then a co-activator comes on and turns on the whole machinery. Right? So let me say that one more time. The ligand comes in, and it can be a whole bunch of different things. It knocks off the off switch here, the co-repressor. A co-activator comes on, then it turns on everything, and then the DNA can work, and it turns on the genes, makes proteins. This co-activator, this blue thing here, turns out to be PGC1 alpha. That's why it's involved in a very complicated switching thing. And this just shows, here you have PGC1 alpha on the PPAR and its friend, and here you have some other receptors. This is a mitochondria, and this is just to show that this is involved in a lot of different processes in the mitochondria. There's our friend ATP. Remember, it makes ATP. That's where everything is stored. So this is just a little bit of that complex mitochondria. Point here being PGC1 alpha is part of that complicated switch with the PPARs. So it turns out that the tool is really a lot more complicated than we ever thought it would be, and it does all sorts of things, but it's certainly necessary to be able to make mitochondria work so you have enough energy. So here's the question. If there's an energy problem, can treatments that target PPARs help with bipolar disorder? Well, it turns out that there are PPARs that are already around. There are PPAR medications that are already around, and they are used for diabetes or for cholesterol. So the question is, can you reuse these things, and would they work in bipolar disorder? So let's look at the anti-diabetic drugs. Because I can't pronounce that name in the middle, let's just call them glitazones, because other people do, because I can't say that word. It's too big. So here are the glitazones. It turns out they turn on the genes to make the PPARs. So you see how complicated it is? You're turning genes on to turn the switches on to do the thing that it has to do, and the other thing comes in and turns that on. It's really complicated. But this then turns on genes that metabolize fat, and basically it metabolizes the fat that's really bad for you, and it takes care of the fat that's good for you and makes a little bit more of that. One of the anti-diabetic drugs, glitazones, is called pioglitazone. So let's see if there's any evidence that pioglitazone does anything for mood disorders. Well, let's see. What does pioglitazone do in the first place? Well, it stimulates the PPARs. It actually works as a ligand, so it helps kick off that co-repressor thing, right? So it does that. It also helps cells be more responsive to insulin, which is why it's used for diabetes, and decreases one of the markers of diabetes, HbA1c. It also decreases some fats, decreases your triglycerides, and also decreases inflammation. All sounds pretty good. So does pioglitazone help with mood disorders? Well, there was a group in Iran that actually did a study, and they looked here on the left. This is the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale scores. Here's the weeks up to week 6. They compared pioglitazone to placebo, and actually pioglitazone did better than placebo. Well, that's pretty interesting. Well, it also turns out that David Kemp over in Cleveland looked and saw whether it would work for bipolar depression in people who also had a weight problem, hypertension, and problems with their blood fats. It's called metabolic syndrome. And he did this as a proof of concept. So people start out with a different scale. It's a quick inventory of depression symptomatology scale. They start out with 16, and 8 weeks later, they're down to about 9. And this is just a proof of concept that at least it seemed to help in this group, and more studies are needed to see if this is really a treatment that will help people over the short run and the long run. The other group of drugs that will stimulate PPARs, stimulate the production of that switch and turn it on, get that co-repressor off, is an old anti-cholesterol drugs called fibrates. There are 3 that are in this country. One is called fenofibrate, another clofibrate, third one is gemfibrozil, and they stimulate the PPARs. And it turns out that in some basic science labs, they found that the fibrates actually protect neurons. There's one in particular called bezafibrate that's not available in Canada, that's available in Canada, Europe, not here yet, but it will be, it looks like they're trying to get it approved as an anti-triglyceride drug. But it protects neurons in animal models of Huntington's disease, Parkinson's disease, ALS, and there are even some models that it may help with traumatic brain injury, again, because it helps turn on that PPAR system. It helps turn on the switches that end up doing good things. So there's an ongoing bezafibrate study that my colleagues and I will do where we will add it to lithium for bipolar depression, and we'll measure if the genes, if it turns on the genes for PGC1 alpha, if it helps with mitochondrial function, and if it helps actually even with thinking. And again, very grateful to the Brain and Behavior Foundation for giving me this award, and we have some additional funding from the Marriott Foundation to pay for other things like an MRI and that sort of thing that we didn't have the money for. So very grateful to both foundations. And finally, exercise. Why would I bring exercise into this? What in the world does this have to do with PPARs? Well, it turns out that Hippocrates may have been right. If we could give every individual the right amount of nourishment and exercise, not too little, not too much, we would have found the safest way to health. So there's a really interesting question. Why is exercise good for you? And it turns out that exercise increases PGC1 alpha, part of that complex switching thing, and decreases inflammation. So if you have chronic exercise, you have PGC1 alpha hit the PPAR here, it turns out it does a lot of good things. I won't go into all the details of that, but it helps decrease rust, the rusting, it decreases inflammation, and it increases mitochondrial and metabolic gene expression, meaning it helps make mitochondria and decreases chronic systemic inflammation. If you have a lot of inactivity, this system doesn't get turned on, and it turns out that you have whole body systemic inflammation. So one of the reasons why exercise may be good for you is because it increases the production of this switch that turns on another switch, the PGC1 alpha. And why is too much TV bad for you? It's because inactivity plus obesity increases inflammation. You have this chronic systemic inflammation just talked about here, and that turns out to be bad for brain cells and causes all sorts of problems, and also makes it so that your fat becomes not the type of fat that you really want, and it changes the way fat cells work and use sugar, right? And that can result in insulin. That's why inactivity, obesity, not good for you. You should be as active as you could. So it turns out, how does this actually work? Well, active muscles will actually produce PGC1 alpha. And then the PGC1 alpha produces something else called FNDC5. And it turns out the FNDC5 then increases brain fertilizer, which is called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is very good for your brain health. Right? So BDNF is a brain fertilizer. It helps new and old neurons be robust and have as many branches as it could. And the neurons actually can help with thinking, and it increases your ability to see things differently, so everything doesn't look the same. So let's see what happens with exercise. First of all, in this very important study, exercise actually helped people lose weight, but it helps people with serious mental illness lose weight, which is very important because that's hard to do. Here's the control, here's the loss of weight, right here. But more importantly, would exercise actually help people to have a better mood? It turns out that there are very few studies that look at this in a rigorous way. But one of the best studies was done by my good friend and colleague, Madhukar Trivedi, down in Dallas. And what Madhukar did was that he had people who exercise very lightly. These are sort of a way of looking at the watts that somebody is putting out, versus another group that would exercise more vigorously. And the story is complex. So it turned out that sex and family history were determinants in who got better in terms of their depression. So this is the percentage of patients who got into full remission with exercise, right? And the real point here This is, in the light blue is light exercise, and the dark blue is more heavier exercise, that overall there was not a difference between light exercise or heavy exercise. About 30% of patients felt better. Women who had a family history of depression, the light exercise actually did better. The women who did not have a family history of depression, the heavier exercise did better. In men, it didn't matter what their family history was. They did a lot better with heavier exercise, but especially the men without any family history. Look at that, almost 85% ended up having a really good response to the exercise alone. All right, so the bottom line here is that exercise helps. It doesn't help everybody in this particular study, and certainly should be studied more as an intervention. Now, my good colleague, Luisa Silvia, put together something called New Treatment, and it's an exercise and nutrition and sleep intervention, and she was able to have people get nearly a 10-pound weight loss within just a few months. They felt that their mood improved, their quality of life improved, and they also had weight loss that improved their depression and their ability to think. So again, just preliminary data that exercise may actually help with this complex switch and the way that we use energy. And there's preliminary data it may very well be helpful. Now, what about other treatments that target mitochondria not through the PPAR system? Right? Are there other ways that you may be able to enhance mitochondria, make them work better, that's not through the switching system that I described earlier? Well, it turns out that there's a type of light that can do this. And this is really quite astounding, but transcranial near-infrared light is a type of light that passes right through your skull. And so it's a handheld device, and it looks like it may be very promising. So let's look at some of the data. First, let's figure out what the heck this is. Transcranial near-infrared light. It passes through the skull, and it turns out that it stimulates mitochondria in a somewhat complex way, but essentially instead of shuttling those electrons along, if you remember I showed you some little electrons, and there's a way that it exchanges with the protons, the hydrogen atoms. Well, instead of providing electrons, it provides photons, which is a form of energy, and stimulates mitochondrial function. There's evidence that transcranial near-infrared light also protects neurons and is anti-inflammatory. And there's a great study by my colleague Paolo Cassano at Massachusetts General Hospital who's doing a study to see if this helps with depression that's supported by the Brain Behavior Research Foundation. And we're extending some of that work with some private donations to look at whether or not this can help with bipolar depression. Oh, one other thing about transcranial near-infrared light. It's so interesting and so protective of neurons that there are some studies that are just starting to see if it can help football players after they have a concussion have less of a problem after a post-concussion and be able to heal quicker. So really, it's very interesting. So let's go back to this just for a moment, because I told you that, it gives a photon instead of an electron. It does that right here, right? So the electrons kind of shuttle across, and they go up there, and then they finally, ends up here, and you get a little ATP. That's how it all works. Well, right here is where the photon hits. It stimulates this here, and then it stimulates more ATP, and that's what turns out to be what protects neurons. Again, the machinery is just incredible. I mean, it's just amazing. And the fact that we could start to poke over here, right here with a photon instead of an electron, to me is nothing short of amazing. So here it is, another picture of it. The near-infrared light goes down there. It hits that complex, and it causes the ATP to form. Forget about the other stuff. That's okay. And this is what one thing looks like this, but there's even a newer one that looks like one of those really inexpensive LED flashlights that have a lot of LEDs in it. That's handheld with a battery and much simpler. But you have to put the light right about there. It goes into the skull, goes into the brain, stimulates that electron transport chain in there, helps with mitochondria, and seems like it decreases inflammation and helps tremendously. So here's the data. This is from Schiffer and colleagues from McLean Hospital. This is a proof of concept of whether the light can actually work with depression. So here's the rating scale score here. And they did the light, and then people got better over a period of 2 weeks. And where there were a lot of people who felt much, much better. A couple people didn't feel that much better. And then when everything was stopped, they sort of lost some of the effect. But the main thing is that some people really responded and felt better with the light. This is light that you're putting on somebody's head. I mean, just think about that. That's just amazing. And again, I applaud the Brain Behavior Foundation to be able to support an extension of this particular work. So in summary, talked about mitochondria, the stars in our head, the constellation of energy-producing organelles, little things that are in our cells. They are exquisite, complex, delicate. There are switches upon switches that take care of how it gets regulated. And there are some new interventions which we try to take advantage of this physiology. So we're trying to see if we can reuse and repurpose anti-diabetic and anti-cholesterol drugs. There is an amazing physiology of exercise, and it may be why exercise is good for your brain. It's probably the best medicine we have in all of medicine. If you're able to be active as much as possible and be consistent and persistent with that, it looks like we need to do more studies to see specifically how it helps with mood disorders, and also talked about light and the transcranial near-infrared radiation as a new way to improve mitochondrial function, have neuroprotection, and maybe even treat mood disorders. And again, very happy to be supported by BBRF. So let me hand that back over to you.
Thank you very, very much. The work that you've done is fascinating and provides so much information. You were able to do it in a way that even lay people can understand. So thank you. We have a number of questions. One of them, there were a few questions about the issue of exercise. And one of the questions relates to the difference between light and heavy exercise. And I wonder if you could give us a little bit more detail as to what each of them would be.
So I think the heavy exercise is where your perceived exertion is a lot, that your heart is beating pretty fast and you're breathing pretty hard. There's some controversy about how long you have to do that for. And there's some evidence that you could do it for as little as 7 minutes a day, every day, or that you need to do it at least 30 minutes 3 to 5 times a week. The light exercise would be something like walking where you can carry on a conversation. So that's the difference between the heavier exercise and the light exercise. Now, one other thing about that, some people love to exercise, and it feels good, and maybe you do it with your friends or you like your solitude. There are people that find heavy exercise aversive, like it's painful and difficult to do. We don't really understand the difference and why some people have a hard time doing it. But I think particularly for people with mood disorders, if nothing else, people with mood disorders are at higher risk of having cardiovascular disease. And having some sort of exercise can substantially reduce that risk. So even if it does or does not work for mood itself, and again, we need more research, it really helps a lot with overall health.
Excellent point. And one of the difficulties even if somebody normally may like exercise, if they are in the midst of a depression, often the depression can get in the way of that. Are there any words of advice and guidance to sort of help push people who, in fact, because of the depression, are less likely to exercise?
So I'm going to talk a little bit about science, and then I'll talk about practical things. The thing about science is that when people are depressed, they predict the future, and they make a choice. And the choice is you can do something that is low cost. It doesn't cost you a lot to do it, but also the reward of doing it isn't great. Let's call that TV. And the other choice you can make is what's called a high cost, high reward. In other words, you've got to get off the couch and go outside and go for a run. And there you have a high cost. It takes more oomph to do it, but you get a bigger reward. Now, the reason I'm telling you high cost, high reward versus low cost, low reward is that when people are depressed, they tend to make their decision based on low cost, low reward. They'd rather just sit on the couch. And there are animal models that actually support this. This is what happens when people are depressed. So in some ways, it leads to a very practical solution. And that is, it's better to get up and go for a walk for 15 minutes, even if it's just a walk, than to stay on the couch. Now, there are several good things about that. One is staying on the couch is just not good for you. But two is if you go out for a walk for 15 minutes, usually you have to come home, and that means you get a 30-minute walk out of it.
So you're sort of giving a push to do even more than you think you're doing.
Right. And also, people shouldn't be so sure about their predictions of whether or not they'll like it or not. They should just try to do it anyway and then see afterwards if they liked it.
Good. Excellent guidance. Anything, there's a couple of questions asking about diet and anything with regards to diet, with regards to the information that you've presented.
Yeah, so I think following the advice of Michael Pollan makes a lot of sense. You should eat the things that your grandmother would recognize as food. Basically, try to minimize anything that is processed, and try to eat as much things that aren't processed. And don't eat too much of it. And I think that very simple advice, if people looked at all of the processed foods that they eat and also processed drinks, and by the way, that includes juice. Right? Juice is processed. It's like having concentrated fruit. If you eat a piece of fruit, rather than having juice, you're better off. But avoiding chips, sweets, and things that are white in a sense. So white bread, white rice, sugar, that sort of thing. But if you go more towards foods that your grandmother would recognize, it's much, much better.
Good. Excellent. With regards to the transcranial near-infrared light, how close is that to being ready for prime time? Where is that in terms of clinical use?
So I don't think it's close to being prime time yet. I think we don't have enough data on it really. So I think that in and of itself, I would wait until we had more data. There are other devices that do bring energy to one's brain. There's a direct cranial stimulation from Fisher-Wallace, and that looks interesting and promising, and some data are starting to come out with that. I'm not sure what the connection is with mitochondria or if they've done specific studies of brain energy metabolism, but I know that particular device, while not a light device, is a way to at least put some energy back in the brain.
And is there a relationship, because we're using the word light, even though it's different mechanisms, is there a relationship between this use of light that you described and the use of light that's used to treat seasonal affective disorder.
Yeah, this is completely different. Yeah, this is completely different than that. This is not going through the retina. And by the way, there's one other thing that is really important for people's brains while I have people on the call, and that's sleep. And that's also related to light, because some people will actually have a very difficult time falling asleep if they've been in front of a screen at night. And so if people are having trouble falling asleep, it's best to avoid looking at screens as much as possible.
So whether it be TV, computer, cell phone,
right?
The light from that affects the sleep-wake cycle.
Yeah.
And a lot of your work has related to people who don't respond to the first line of treatment for depression or bipolar. What guidance do you give to people who might be on the call right now who haven't responded? They've had some treatment, it hasn't worked. What do you say to them?
So I think if treatments have failed you, that it's probably worthwhile trying to get a consult from somebody to be able to, first of all, make sure that not only is the diagnosis correct, but nothing else has been missed. So for example, people with bipolar disorder frequently don't have their anxiety treated, and that's not seen as important, but it can be. The other thing is that there are always things that might be able to be used in different ways. There are new treatments that are coming out all the time. There's always electroconvulsive therapy. There's the growing use of repetitive transcranial magnetic therapy, and there's even deep brain stimulation. And I think these sort of things can help a lot, but certainly I would advise people to, at the very least, talk to their doctors about getting a consultation.
Okay, so really getting a second opinion.
Yeah.
If this hasn't worked, don't give up. Get a second opinion and a fresh perspective, a careful look.
Right.
Okay. And the issue of chemical dependency along with bipolar disorder. What do you see as the most effective way for people with bipolar, for family members who are concerned about them, to help them when there is that dual diagnosis?
So several things about that. It might surprise the audience that one of the most harmful things that people can do in terms of substance abuse is actually tobacco. And it would be essential to try as best as possible to do everything you can do to stop smoking. That's the substance that actually causes the greatest amount of problems. The second one is alcohol. And it's very hard, as you know, for many people to stop drinking. And I think AA and other supportive organizations like that are enormously helpful. There are some medications that can also help, and you should talk to your doctor about that. The other thing that can really make things worse is cocaine. That's particularly a problem for people with bipolar disorder. And marijuana can really make people have no motivation, which can be another sort of problem. But I think for those people who have both, and there are a lot of people who have both, getting help for both, I think, can make a huge difference.
So the reality is you can't treat one without the other. You really need to treat both hand in hand at the same time. I think
in order to minimize and decrease suffering, you really have to address both.
In terms of the issue of energy, some of the medications that have been used for a long time, such as lithium and Depakote, is there information on how they fit into this puzzle of bipolar as an energy disorder?
Yeah, there are certain things that lithium does which actually helps with brain energy, and so does valproate. And it's a complicated story, but they seem to be quite helpful. It's a little less clear with the mood stabilizers that are second-generation antipsychotics, as you know, and many people know, people feel sedated from a lot of that. And the sedation, I think, is caused by many things, not just having to do with mitochondria, but having to do chemically with what it does to the histamine system. So it's all a complex thing about, well, there's energy having to do with your brain, then there's energy having to do with not getting enough sleep, and then there's energy having to do with just being tired from the medication. And I think that can all blend together to make a complex picture.
Okay, so some of the initial mood stabilizers may have direct effect. Some of the second-generation antipsychotics, it's not so clear.
Right.
What the effect is.
Right.
And how about whether it be in bipolar or in depression, the antidepressant medications? How do they fit into that puzzle?
So antidepressants turn out to also promote the making of the brain fertilizer, the BDNF. And it does that through a whole complex other set of things. And with increased BDNF, you may also have increased brain energy, and it also can protect neurons from all the other things that's happening. So that may be part of the story. Although I do have to say that in bipolar disorder, it's really unclear if the antidepressants really help. It's still a controversial story, but there's essentially no studies that show that any antidepressant is better than placebo in bipolar depression. A lot of people are using an anticonvulsant, lamotrigine or Lamictal, but that's not quite an antidepressant. And the three drugs that are approved for bipolar depression is a combination of olanzapine fluoxetine, there's quetiapine, and then there is lurasidone. But otherwise, the role of antidepressants in bipolar disorder, not entirely clear.
And one of the important issues in treating depression and certainly in bipolar disorder is the issue of suicide risk. And God forbid a patient attempting and succeeding in suicide. The work that you're doing, how does the issue of suicide fit into that?
So there are basically two situations that increase the risk of suicide in bipolar disorder, which won't be surprising to any of you. One is that people end up deciding to kill themselves when either they're depressed or when they're in a mixed state. When they have bipolar depression, it's pretty clear. When people are in a mixed state, they have a mixture of depressive symptoms and manic symptoms, and they're agitated and anxious. Very painful for people to be in that. So I think that because bipolar depression is really the big, persistent, recurrent problem in bipolar disorder, anything that can decrease bipolar depression will also decrease the risk of suicide.
Okay, so really being very careful in treating those, making sure that the depressive symptoms are being treated.
Yes.
Okay. And with all this, how does the role of talk therapy fit into it?
So talk therapy for some people is just absolutely essential. And actually, my colleagues and I, Thilo Deckersbach and colleagues, found that therapy made a huge difference in one of the studies that we did, if and only if there was also anxiety. Otherwise, there wasn't that much difference between intensive psychotherapy and a little bit of education. So I think that it may suggest that if somebody really has a lot of anxious symptoms, those are the people who really should seek therapy. And also, people have had a difficult time in their lives and had trauma and that sort of thing. That also can be enormously helpful. But I think particularly for the long-term course of bipolar disorder, that therapy can make a huge difference.
Good. And let me ask a final question, which is looking down the road, 5 years, 10 years, even beyond, what do you see, where will we be in terms of treatment of these disorders?
So I think we, in the best of all worlds, in 10 years, we would really have personalized medicine. We would have a way of biologically characterizing people so we can match people to the treatments that they have. We're trying to do this with something that's called the Mood Network that is funded by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And we're going to try to bring together 50,000 people to see if we can figure out together what is going on, how we can characterize people, how we can partner with them to figure out who should get what treatment. And I think that's going to be the future.
Well, that's an exciting future, and one that will obviously improve care for people and sort of increase the likelihood that the first treatment selected will work, as opposed to having to go through trial and error,
right?
Which often happens. I want to thank you so much for an extremely informative presentation, and even more importantly, for all of the work that you have done, continue to do, and will do to find better treatments and ultimately cures for these conditions. So thank you very, very much.
And thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. I also want to thank our audience for joining us today. The Foundation, through its research grants, is dedicated to improving the lives of people with a wide variety of psychiatric conditions. And I thank you for joining us on that mission. All of the research we fund is made possible through private donations. So if you'd like to make a gift, please visit bbrfoundation.org or call 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded, so if you've missed any portion or want to share it with a friend, please visit the webinar page at our website. And I hope you'll join us again next month. At that point, Dr. Ronald Duman of Yale University will present a webinar entitled Repairing the Brain's Communication Network to Treat Depression. And that will take place on Tuesday, November 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Finally, if you're in the New York area on October 24th, we invite you to join us for the Foundation's upcoming conference, the 26th Annual New York Mental Health Research Symposium. You'll hear from the 2014 Outstanding Achievement Prize winners and select young investigators on leading research across brain and behavior disorders. And we'll have a keynote presentation by Dr. Kay Redfield Jameson, the best-selling author and professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins. For more information, again, visit us at the website. Once again, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.